Alright, so welcome to the third video in this little series that is discussing rhythm in poetry. So in the previous video, what we discussed were the basic units of rhythm, that is syllables, and we discussed how there were two types of syllables, the first one being stressed and the second one being unstressed. And we talked about how rhythm is actually created through a combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. So what we're doing now is we're actually thinking about feet. So a foot in rhythm or in meter is a unit, like kilograms or centimeters. It's a unit of measurement that is repeated in a line of poetry. So think of feet as the building blocks of meter. So for example, we might say that a particular line in a poem has 4 feet, or a particular line in a poem has 5 feet. We might say that a stanza in a poem is made up of 3 lines of 4 feet and 1 line of 3 feet. Okay, so it's a unit, like kilograms or centimeters. Now, feet are made up of syllables, stressed and unstressed syllables. That's where the link is between this video and the previous one. So a foot is made up of stressed and unstressed syllables. Now, each foot has exactly 1 stressed syllable and 1 or 2 unstressed syllables. And you'd be hard-pressed to find any foot that has any more than that. Okay, so once again, each foot has exactly 1 stressed syllable and 1 or 2 unstressed syllables. Now, what could that look like? So here are the different kinds of feet. There are 4 different kinds of feet, which are very common in poetry. There are more than this, but these are the 4 that you probably should be at least aware of. And this is where some memorization work actually comes into play. So as you see this in action, as you get used to identifying the meter of a line of poetry or a whole poem, then hopefully you'll get accustomed to these kinds of terms. Okay, so here are the different kinds of feet. Note for the feet with 3 syllables, the stress syllable indicates when the foot starts and ends. So there are 4 types of feet: an iamb, a trochee, a dactyl, and an anapest. Now, don't ask me where these names came from because I've got no idea. I don't know why they couldn't have made it a little simpler, but that's what they are: iamb, trochee, dactyl, and anapest. Now, if you studied Shakespeare before, your teacher might have mentioned to you that Shakespeare writes in iambic pentameter, which basically means that he writes in iambs. He writes in using feet of unstressed and stressed syllables, and we'll talk about pentameter and all that in a second. So here's a visual way of remembering it: iamb, trochee, anapest, and dactyl. Iamb is unstressed and stressed, da-dum. Trochee is stressed and unstressed, dum-da. Anapest is 2 unstressed and stressed, da-da-dum. And dactyl is stressed and 2 unstressed, dum-da-da. So iamb would sound like da-dum, 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 da-dum. Trochee would sound like dum-da, 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 dum-da. Anapest would sound like da-da-dum, 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 da-da-dum. And dactyl would sound like dum-da-da, 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 dum-da-da. So hopefully just from me mouthing out and sounding out the sounds of an iamb, a trochee, an anapest, and a dactyl, hopefully that you can hear how a rhythm might be created through these sounds. Okay, stressed and unstressed syllables. Now again, a lot of this comes down to memorization work, but it also comes down to your ability to develop your hearing and your listening so that you can hear what's unstressed and what's stressed, and what kind of foot or what kind of feet are being used in a line of poetry. Okay, so each line of a poem contains a certain number of feet. So again, let's use the example that one line of poetry in a poem contains 4 feet. So how would we actually describe that? Well, here are some terms used to describe the number of feet in a line of poetry. So, if you have a line of poetry with only 1 foot, that is, for example, 1 iamb, or 1 trochee, or 1 dactyl, or 1 anapest, we would call that monometer. Mono meaning 1, and then meter obviously indicating the rhythm. So essentially 1 rhythm. 1 foot equals monometer. 2 feet equals dimeter. 3 feet trimeter. 4 feet tetrameter. 5 feet pentameter. 6 feet hexameter, and so on and so forth. So one way to try and remember all these terms is to think of a shape with the same number of sides as feet in a line. So let's say, for example, there are 6 feet in a line of poetry, and you're like, I can't remember what that's called. All you need to do is think of a hexagon which has 6 sides. You take the first part of the word, the prefix hexa, and then you just attach it to meter, so it becomes hexameter. And here is a visual way of looking at it. Okay, you might want to pause the video here just so that you can go through the terms. Now you might wonder, what's the importance of this? Well, when you're actually describing the meter of a poem, then you will need to use these terms. Okay, let's see this in action. So, these are 2 lines from a poem called Burning Sapphire by Gwen Harwood, a famous Australian poet. So, how many feet are in each of these lines? Right, there are 4 feet in each of these lines. Okay. 1 for the clothes, 1 for are washed, 1 for the house, 1 for is clean. So we've got the clothes are washed, the house is clean. It's 4 feet in the first one, and that's actually repeated in the next line. I find my pen and start to write. Again, 4 feet. So what is this? Let's go back to the previous slide. 4 feet per line, it's tetrameter. Now we have to describe the syllables in these lines of poetry. So what we see here is that each line contains 4 feet, and each foot is made up of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, which is da-dum, an iamb. So what that means is that these lines of poetry are iambic tetrameter. Tetrameter because there are 4 feet in each line. Iambic because the feet are made up of iambs. Iambic tetrameter. So most students get a bit hung up about the language, but once you get used to that, it's actually pretty easy to describe the meter of a poem. Okay. In our last video, we're going to put that all together and think about how it can contribute to the meaning of a poem.